we seem safer statistically than ever before, and yet danger is signalled from every direction. Do you remember the flesh-eating bug that was going to be storming through the Channel Tunnel? Do you remember avian flu? I seem to remember swine flu. All these risks, the stranger danger, despite the fact that you're more likely to be murdered by someone you know and love than a stranger. All these risks are very present, as is the eternal cliche of the nanny state. Is our perception of risk being shaped by an overcautious state? Should the state back off? Should the regulations be diminished? Should we all be allowed to make our own judgment about how we live? Well, that's what we are going to be talking about. We have a splendid panel, 2 out of 3. The third one clearly made a risk assessment about getting here on time and didn't quite get it right. But we live in hope that Douglas Murray will arrive. And in the meantime, I'd like to introduce our 2 splendid speakers, David Lammy, a former cabinet minister under Gordon Brown, talking of risks, mastermind contestant, friend of Barack Obama and Harvard Law School graduate, and one of Britain's youngest MPs, and on my far left, Dylan Evans, who is a distinguished writer, a behavioral scientist, and he's the CEO of his own risk intelligence company, Projection Point. The format is that our speakers will have 3 minutes to make their case. We then have a little discussion up here, and then we open it to you, and we have to finish on time so the next event comes in. So if you have questions, please be ready with them. And right now I'm going to ask David Lammy to kick off, addressing himself to the question, are we right to seek safety, or is risk in itself desirable?
Well, can I say that I found myself as Higher Education Minister summoned to a COBRA meeting, and this was where all ministers are dragged to the same place, and we have to prepare for the possibility of an avian flu. And I suppose, as with responsibilities for higher education, it was my job to make sure that students didn't touch one another and end up contaminated and dying desperately on our campuses. So I suppose my point of view is that we have lost touch with the balance of risk. And that's for 2 reasons, and I think they are largely to do with the 2 major revolutions of the latter part of the 20th century. The first, I think we can put down to the Tories, which is a kind of neoliberal economics that has placed, particularly on this occasion, not necessarily the banking industry, but the insurance industry behind lots of decisions. It means we live in a fear of litigation type culture, which means that teachers don't want to hug children if they're upset. It means that you can't take a photograph of your child if they're at a public swimming pool. And then alongside that, and perhaps my party has more responsibility for this other part of the equation, we have a rights culture. Now, we applaud, obviously, the major advances in relation to race, women, and freedoms that we've all acquired in the latter part of the 20th century. But it has led to a place where we are all individualists. So there's a place in which the Telegraph and the Guardian meet, neoliberal sort of freedom individualists, and those who want to assert their right over the collective right. That leads to a place where risk and a proper assessment of risk gets shut out, and where you want government to make everything sanitised and safe for you. And politicians fall into this trap because, of course, we can't. Tragic, terrible things happen. I mean, just to end, some of you will have heard Sharon Shoesmith on radio yesterday morning. I know she got a hard time from John Humphrys, but what she was trying to say is that tragically, in this country, it is still the case that people kill their children. And we must never find ourselves in a place where we believe that the state, through social services, can obliterate this and stop this happening. Tragic things happen, and it's our job to assess, as people, as communities, as neighbourhoods, as families, what that risk is, and most often it's a 1 in a million chance.
David, thank you very much. Dylan, if I could just ask you to address the same question.
I think risk, we have to distinguish between 2 questions. One is how much risk do we want to take on, and that's a question of preferences. But the other question is, how good are we at estimating the risks to start with? We can't know how much, we can't make informed decisions about how much risk we want to take on or how much we want to mitigate risks unless we get good estimates of what those risks are in the first place. And unfortunately, the evidence is that most of us are incredibly bad at estimating risks. And I don't think this is just down to sort of recent political changes, although obviously those are important too. I think it's much deeper than that. I think it's deep in our psychology. I think that for 50 years of research in psychology has shown us that we're incredibly bad at estimating risks, and even people whose jobs require high-risk intelligence, such as bankers and people who work at credit rating agencies and so on, often make very basic errors when estimating the likelihood of certain outcomes. Now, one of the reasons we do that is because we rely on a bunch of cognitive shortcuts and heuristics which seem to work well when we're evolving but sort of let us down in the modern environment. And in particular, if we tend to overestimate the likelihood of very visual risks. If it's easy to visualize a particular dramatic scenario, we tend to overreact to that. And I think one important problem with democracy is that politicians have really no incentive to try and go against that, and every incentive to kind of pander to that public fear, that widespread public worry, because government regulation is affected by the public demand for law, and so it's likely to stumble on particularly the challenges that David was talking about, the low probability harms. So I think there is a role for government regulation, but it's one that has to take a step back and not swiftly capitulate if the public is demonstrating about some worried risk, and maybe sort of sit back. And something in America, for example, they have this office called the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, headed by Cass Sunstein, one of Barack Obama's advisors, and their job is precisely to monitor what other government departments are doing and sort of make sure that they don't sort of direct public resources to risks which are perhaps very unlikely to occur. So I don't think public fear should trump the argument. I don't think it should be ignored either. In fact, I think sometimes there may be arguments for sort of worrying about public fear as a risk in itself, but it needs to be bundled in with all the other things. Finally, though, I'd just like to say that it's not just the public that make all these mistakes. Politicians themselves, may be exaggerating certain risks, not because they've got some dark agenda that they're trying to foster by means of evoking fear in the public, but just because they themselves too are bad at estimating risks. And I think there's a common tendency to blame other people for this. So in the financial crisis, it was common to sort of heap blame on the bankers. But what about the borrowers too? It takes two people to make a bad loan. Someone who, lends the money and someone who borrows it unwisely. So I'll just leave you with that sort of provocative thought.
A plea for sympathy for bankers. So, well, we're delighted to welcome Douglas Murray, Director of the Centre for Social Cohesion, a self-proclaimed neocon and defenders of neoconservatism, author of Neoconservatism and Why We Need It. Douglas, I'm asking all panellists and therefore you to address, are we right to seek safety, or is risk itself a desirable thing?
Well, thank you, and first of all, apologies. I just came from New York, and the Germany was going absolutely swimmingly until Newport, as is always the way with these things. So apologies for not hearing all of Dylan's remarks or any of David's. The first thing is I've just... the US is quite a good place to have been in recent days before discussing something like this. I was at a discussion the other day in Washington where there was somebody from the Cato Institute, and some of you will know the sort of ideas that come out of that, and they're not mine, but I always find it very interesting to hear a sort of right-wing libertarian argument on the nature of risk and safety. And obviously, at its extremes, it's always risible. I mean, the sort of libertarians who don't want any stop signs on the roadside, that sort of thing. I don't go that far, but I would just start by saying this, which is that risk in itself is not only an important but a vital part of life. It not only helps us thrive in work, helps us thrive in whatever it is we wish to attain in our working life, but it's also a vital part of our personal life, about a vital part of what it is that keeps us interested, keeps us intrigued by the world. The more cosseted an existence becomes, I would argue the less open our minds are to ideas, to perils which we need to keep us on track. The problem is, of course, is that government, in a day like this, and this is why I have some sympathy with the libertarian argument, government's instinct is always, of course, to metastasize. Its tendency, of course, is to metastasize. It never, or at least very, very rarely, decides that it's going to stop where it is. Civil servants very rarely sack each other. They very rarely get rid of departments. If there's a problem, a department is set up to deal with the problem, and then the problem is never dealt with because the department set up to deal with the problem doesn't want to deal with the problem, otherwise they'll be out of work as well, and so on. So government really is the worst set of people in some ways to deal with this issue. And for one other reason also, which I would say, which is this, is that government can tell people what to do, but it is extremely hard for government to guide. And in most things in life, guidance rather than telling is what's needed, certainly when we're in adulthood. And so as a result, dangers are often made far worse than they should be. The danger of life is stressed by government. And for one other reason, which I am sympathetic to them for, which is this, that when you're given all of the information that government is given, and David in particular will know this, that, for instance, on terrorism, let me give you a very quick example. If you get the briefs every morning of every single possible risk to the people in this tent and elsewhere, you will be very scared. You and I will be less scared if we don't know anything about it. We will be naive and stupid and blind if we know none of it. But then government has a very difficult choice, which I just finished with, which is this, which is that, does it tell you that you've got to watch out for bombs, or does it just keep quiet? And somewhere in the middle of those two instincts, I suppose, is where most of us sit.
Or there might be a judgment between possibility and probability. I mean, if we're looking at the assessment of risk. But we've got on to this question of the state and what the state's role is. And this cliché which is endlessly repeated about the nanny state. I mean, do we live in a nanny state? And if so, should we be doing something about it? Is it a bad thing to live in a nanny state? Shouldn't the state be trying to keep us safer? Dave?
Well, I suspect I'm not entirely in the same place as Douglas, so I've probably just got to make sure there's some good red water between us. So let us be absolutely clear. I don't want to go back to the 19th century. I think the invention of a welfare state, of an insurance system, of us pooling our resources together to take care of those who fall on hard times, particularly if you're a pensioner, if you are sick, if you are unemployed, is a civilised invention. I want to absolutely stand by that Attlee government and all of that. However, I do want to assert, and this is where there is some scope for dialogue and discussion and where I would associate myself with part of what has been said, we must be vigilant that the state doesn't get too big and doesn't start to usurp individuals, families, neighbourhoods, communities, assessing risk and making judgments that should rightfully lay with them. And so there is the conversation. I think that currently the discussion about a big society is worrying because it takes us backward. There are no resources that go with it.